actually a quite long story in the sense that I think the sort of first contacts between Norway and Australia was very much based on the people-to-people contact. So Norwegians emigrating to Australia to try to make a better life for themselves and their families. All the way back to more or less, not the first fleet time, but not very far after either. We started to get Norwegian families coming to Australia, and a lot of the first ones who came were connected to the Norwegian maritime sector. Either they were sailors themselves, they were shipbuilders and so forth, and they established themselves here connected to the same industry for a large part, mostly in Queensland, New South Wales. Those were the first sort of wave of immigration. Also, the ocean has sort of, I think, been the binding kind of topic and element for the relationship. And Norwegian shipping companies have been active in Australia, doing business with Australia for more than 100 years. So they've actually had a sort of longer relationship with Australia than we have in diplomatic relations. So that was maybe the sort of first element of our collaboration. We had a Norwegian who was part of, or at least one, a bit more famous than the others most likely, a Norwegian who was part of the convicts as well, ended up in Port Arthur, got freed there because he was an incredibly good painter. So he managed to paint Tasmania in a more sort of romantic way than what Tasmania was known for at that time. But later on, I think what has characterized the relationship is still those kind of people-to-people relations, in the sense that this is a very popular place to come for Norwegian students. We have about 2,000 Norwegian students coming here. And have had now for quite some time. It doesn't sound like a big number compared to some of the other groups that you have, but for Norway that means that this is more or less the sixth most popular country for Norwegian students to go to when they study abroad. We have the working holiday visas, so about 500 Norwegian young people come here and do different types of jobs in different parts of the country. And then we have about 10,000 Norwegian citizens who live in Australia, and about 25,000 who say they have some sort of Norwegian descent. That is one part, that's the more sort of historical part, and from that springs also the trade relationship, which has again been very much connected to the sort of maritime sector, I would say. I'm talking to you now in Perth at the AOG conference, Australia's Oil and Gas, and that is now, I think, the main sort of hub of Norwegian companies being involved in Australia. So we've sort of ended up in the very modern part of the maritime sector in our relationship. It's become a very important part, but it's really sort of running back all the way to the sort of start of the relationship. That's an interesting question in the sense that I think that that is some of the things that I've discovered after I came here as an ambassador, that the importance of the First World War, for instance, is very, very strong in your history, in your identity, I think, and obviously also in your connections with Europe and the United States. Norway was not part of the First World War, so that was something that we were observing more from a distance. The Second World War, we had a totally different experience. We were an occupied country during the war, and thus did not have the same sort of experience as Australia either. I think, though, that we have been having Norwegian soldiers standing side by side with Australian soldiers in most of the international operations after the Second World War, in United Nations operations or in later on NATO-led peacekeeping operations, for instance, in Afghanistan and so forth. So in that sense, the more sort of modern history, we have shared more direct experiences. Norway has a very, obviously, a very sort of live memories of the Second World War, which has been very significant in our history, and we still have a lot of people who lived at that time and experienced occupation. We didn't have the same sort of amount of Norwegian soldiers who lost their lives or who contributed in the operations, and thus the experience is quite different. I have to probably sort of start with saying that we're not one of Australia's major trading partner, but I think we have been, as I said, a long-standing partner, particularly in ocean-related industry or in the maritime sector. Today, our trade relationship is very much dominated by the oil and gas sector. Perth is a hub for the Norwegian companies. It's more than 40 companies who have established themselves here out of the between 60 and 70 companies that we have who are active in Australia and have established themselves here. So the oil and gas, and particularly the supply sector, the supply industry, is now an important part of that trading relationship. The shipping companies are still also very much active here. Wilhelmsen Wallenius is still a big shipping company. They have more than 130 years experience in Australia, and they're still very active. Some of the offshore shipping companies are the biggest offshore employer still in Australia. So that's definitely a major sort of part of the relationship. Defense industry, which is obviously something that your readers and viewers probably are more interested in. That's also an area that is of importance in our trading relationship. There's been Norwegian defense industry active in Australia now for the last few decades, and I think that they are seeing increasingly that Australia is an interesting market for also Norwegian defense industry. Obviously these days, with the sort of record high investment programs for your government in the defense sector, I think the whole world is looking a bit to the Australian market and trying to be part of that big sort of investment program, and that is also important for Norwegian industry. And then we have a few other types of sectors that are represented, but they are much smaller companies. But some of them, for instance, in the health space sector, particularly digital health, is something that we hope we can see grow into the future. These numbers are from the last numbers we have, 2016, 2017. And then the Norwegian export of services to Australia was about 400 million Australian dollars. The Australian export of services to Norway is considerably lower, 250, a bit more, million Australian dollars. Norwegian export of goods into Australia, about $308 million. Australian export of goods to Norway, about a bit more than 70 million Australian dollars. As you can see, these are not incredibly high figures, but I think that we agree that there is hopefully room to improve this into the future, and I think that that is something that the embassy has been working on, promoting these kind of opportunities for Norwegian business in Australia. And I know that my colleague, the Australian ambassador who sits in Copenhagen, is doing her very best to do exactly the same vis-a-vis Australian companies here in Australia to make more known the sort of opportunities, the kind of common interest that we share, which also makes for economic opportunities. And that's actually quite a fundamental question, and I think it lies to the heart of the strong people-to-people contact that's been over the centuries between our two countries. And I think there's an instant likability between, sort of affinity between Norwegians and Australians. I think we have a fairly sort of similar approach to maybe, well, everything from outdoors life, for instance, being active outdoors life. It's something that both Australians and Norwegians tend to cherish. I think we're very direct in the way we communicate. I think we're quite informal. I think we share a lot of the same sense of humor. And these things might be considered minor and almost insignificant when you talk about sort of bilateral relations in an international global scene, but they do actually matter when it comes to the people-to-people contact, which I think lies at the heart of any bilateral relationship. But I should add, of course, because it's another element which is very significant, and that is that politically Australia and Norway has traditionally been like-minded in a lot of areas, and we have worked very, very closely together as international partners, not just, as I mentioned earlier, in international military operations like in Afghanistan, but in United Nations, in WTO, in basically all international and regional organizations. We have long-standing traditions of working very closely for the same sort of objectives. And that is something that is very important to our bilateral relationship as well. Being so distant from each other geographically, there is a sort of natural limit to how much direct bilateral cooperation that you can have. But we compensate with having that very strong, very close international cooperation.